Here's a letter to my previous self, what I wish I knew before I jumped into the overwhelming at times world of Age of Wonders 4. Here are some tips and tricks for you to learn from my key mistakes. Sit back and relax, and let's jump straight in. First and foremost, nothing is ever too final. Take your hero skills, for example, which can be reset at any point if you put your points into things that you don't quite like, including the ever-powerful signature hero skills. But of course, it doesn't just stop there. Many of the decisions that you make at the beginning of the game, including those around cosmetics, can be changed at any point too. Name, arm length, pose, you name it. Of course, some of the decisions you won't be able to change, like your societal traits or your culture. However, some of the things we're about to move on to in this video will help you change that by adding to your affinity and supplanting what you already have. Which ties us nicely through into number 2, that character really matters, including your affinity, but also many other things, like the alignment of yourself and your enemies. Similarly aligned characters will be more likely to get along. What really drives the enemy though, and I wish I knew this sooner, was their personality type. Here you can see everything from what they like and dislike, to even their game strategy, how they'll pursue warfare, and all sorts of other things that I can read into, in this case, the tribal minions led by Goblin Gobbler. All of this will feed into their relations, and ultimately what they choose to do to me, how they choose to interact. Maybe they try and forward settle me because they're super aggressive, drawing grievances, or maybe I'm forced to fight them at a cost of Imperium, something we'll talk about later. But first, understanding research is key. Research is the fundamental thing that you'll unlock new units, new enchantments, and all sorts of things. In this case, Lightning Blades is one of my research options, and it's a unit enchantment spell. It'll take me 2 turns. The other thing to really understand is research cycles. Down here, you can see that I'll unlock my next tome, which will be filled with all sorts of spells like lightning blades that I can research in 2 cycles. That means I have to research 2 more spells, and once I do that, I'll be able to unlock an entirely new tome of magic. And that tome of magic will, as I say, have all sorts of new spells inside of it. At the beginning of the game, we'll start with these tomes, Tier 1, and we'll move through Tier 2 and 3 just by picking up tomes from the tier beforehand. 2 at each level to move through. It doesn't matter what affinity they are, it doesn't matter what color they are, just grab 2 of these Tier 1 tomes and you'll be able to research your way to Tier 2. It does get a little bit more complicated, and I wish I'd known this at the start as well. To get to Tier 4 and 5, you have to have some affinity points into that specific affinity if you want to reach for those higher levels of tome. The nature tomes, by the way, at Tier 1 are fantastic, some of the best out there. I'd highly recommend those to any budding new players who are a little bit confused by the tome discussion. We'll also, of course, be adding to our affinity every time, and as I say, this will be important if we want to reach for the Tier 4 tomes for 8 points, or Tier 5 tomes where we'll need 10 affinity points. We can reach through and have a look at any tome type, and all of them, regardless of their tier, will feed 2 of those crucial affinity points into my total. But this might lead you asking, well, what do we use that for then? And this is an important thing to understand as well. Affinities and development. I can see my affinities at the top right at any point, and they feed into the development tree in a very specific way. Turns available to unlock this, for example, are 8. I need 40 astral affinity points in total to get there, and I'm only getting 2 per turn. If we take a look over at something a little bit more shadowy though, you can see here I've got 48 in total, I'm getting 4 per turn. Thanks to unlocking more tomes of magic and investing more into that affinity, I'm unlocking its benefits faster. And all of that is hard-coded in, and of course it's all driven by Imperium, a resource that's difficult to earn. You can't build improvements to get it. There are only a few buildings that can, and some race-specific features too. It's important to keep in mind that Imperium will really drive the development of this very powerful tree. It will of course drive other things as well. And the affinities, yet again, rear their beautiful head. This time we're taking a look back at Goblin Gobbler, and we can see that different affinities will be more likely to attract him as a friend, or push him away as an enemy. For example, nature affinity is opposed to shadow, and so on and so forth. And all of this will feed into my relations with other empires and ultimately impact whether they're my friend or my foe. Moving along to city and hero caps, I've got some clarifications I need to issue and some information to share. Your city cap starts at 3. That's the denominator of this faction, 1 out of 3. I can build up to 3 cities before I suffer. I do that, of course, by upgrading my outposts, and I build my outposts by simply walking a hero unit around to a tile, selecting it, and then building an outpost down. Now, as I'm developing and growing, here's another city popped out of nowhere, it's Dim Tur, you'll notice that my city cap is now at 2 out of 3. That's, of course, fundamentally how it works. I can add to it in a few different ways, but it's important to note that my hero cap is slightly distinct. My hero cap is limited by how many cities I have, not my city cap. So if I take extra and go over top, suffering a knowledge penalty, I can still have more heroes. Inside of the development tree that we were talking about earlier, under the general affinity, which they all feed into, I can get expanded governance. And I wish I knew at the start that this one is repeatable. Once for 200 Imperium, again for 500. I can add to my city cap over and over. Or I could choose to deal with my existing cities, either releasing them out as a vassal under this handy, slightly hidden city information screen, or alternatively burning a city to the ground. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, it will add to your evil alignment, but hey, you do you out there, mighty ruler of a mighty empire. Do take care as you move through, though, a quick tidbit that your Imperium will suffer not just from those unjustified wars that we talked about earlier, but also higher up units at tier 4 and tier 5 mythic units. They will start to cost you some Imperium potentially, so take care, because you might just stall out altogether. And of course, that doesn't just go for Imperium, it's not the only resource. Mana is another one that you could be easily gatekept out of thanks to unit upkeep and enchantment upkeep. So really, be cautious as you develop and as you grow, and take care around the edges. Moving on to my next point, something slightly earlier in the piece, clustering and expanding. Placing early cities can be difficult. You need to factor in what kind of tiles you've got, where you can attract population and expand to get the best bang for your buck, but I'd also like to note that building cities close together is generally a really good idea. Perhaps not quite as close as here, but actually quite close to it. If you have a little bit more space and you're playing on a larger map, you might want to leave 3 or 4 tiles between each one. One of the main reasons is for the victory conditions. Both the expansion and the magic victory require you to build beacons, or essentially tile improvements, that you can only have 1 of per city, but you need 3 of them in total. It therefore makes a lot of sense that you cluster your cities close together so that you can build these improvements and defend them more readily. There are also some bonuses across things like order, which benefit from having adjacent cities, and of course, defense, baby. Speaking of defense, that reminds me of unit types and abilities. It's a really good idea to spend a minute to right-click in, have a look at your units, and remind yourself about the paper, scissors, rock that's going on here. Shock units like my warrior, for example, have charge attacks, and they counter those defensive shield units, but they are themselves countered by pole-armed units. So we might want to bring in something with a little bit of range, which is affected by line of sight and can't fire its main ranged attack when it's engaged. All of these different units, unit types, all revolve around that ultimate paper, scissors, rock of a shock unit beating a defender, a ranged unit beating, etc, etc. They all have their counters and their parries, and it's important to note that some units, like magical ones or heroes, can have even more information. So don't be afraid to delve into the tooltips like I am here, to read about polearm units when you don't even have one selected. It's really good just to have that base knowledge in the back of your head. Of course, there are other things to note, like morale, which can affect things like your critical hit chance or your chance of fleeing, as well as that unit upkeep that we were talking about earlier. It really can lay on thick and fast, and you can isolate it right here. And that brings me to my final point on victory. It's time to reward me, chump. So as you move through into the pantheon, you'll be given pantheon points based on your, essentially how well you did. Inside of this tree, there are a lot of cosmetic things, But there are also some really important things, like societal traits, such as chosen destroyers, all the way down the bottom here, silver-tongued, also right down the bottom. Some of them are higher up, like the ranger one, for example, or of course, the very powerful mana addicts, but it's important to note that there are a few things that aren't cosmetic that will impact the kind of races that you can build, and so you might want to focus down some of those, particularly down the bottom right-hand side of the tree, as you move through. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you next time.